Good morning, everyone. I'm very honoured to have three representatives of the English whisky industry with us this morning from three fantastic distilleries. We're going to be talking all things English whisky, what makes it unique, the sort of future ahead for what is obviously a very young category within the whisky world, and we'll go into some of the kind of the details and the nuances of what makes English whisky so unique. But before I do that, I'd love to introduce our panelists today. So a very warm welcome to you, Abby from Cooper King. Would you like to just give yourself a little introduction?
Hi, yes, so I'm Abby Nielsen from Cooper King Distillery. So we are an independent distillery just up in York, and my business was founded from an adventure. So my partner Chris and I quit our jobs in 2016, travelled to the other side of the world, found ourselves in Australia at the time when a Tasmanian whisky won World's Best Single Malt. And so this was pretty big news, and it was the time when the industry was experiencing, like, you know, massive growth, loads of excitement around it. Anyway, it turns out we became massively inspired to basically create our own distillery based on some of the sort of principles that we learned from Tasmania, which was, you know, provenance, transparency. And so we returned to York we returned to York in 2016 after 2 years of travels, and we self-built, crowd-funded the distillery. And in 2019, we started laying down our first English single malt whiskey casks, which are made using a Tasmanian whisky still. And our Gold Award winning new make is now just about to turn 3, so it legally becomes whisky this year.
Very exciting. And I know that there's a lot of passion up there around sustainability and other things, which I know we'll touch on later in this session. I'll now move over to Chico from Oxford Ardstown Distillery, or colloquially known as Toad.
Hey everyone, yeah, I'm Chico from the Oxford Ardstown Distillery. We are a small distillery pretty much in city centre Oxford, and we are focused on growing quite unique grains to produce a wide range of spirits, which whiskey is our focus. Our main whiskies are rye based, but we have other whiskies made from corn and from a lot of other unique varieties of grains that I'm going to cover later on. We also we like to see us as a very kind of artisan, as we kind of design our own stills and in a quite quirky way, and we pay special attention to some details that usually are not so paid for, but yeah, great to be here. Talk to you guys.
And obviously, that's not a local Oxford accent you've got going on there.
No. My accent sometimes get messed up with French or some Eastern European, but I'm from Portugal. Although the other day I was in Lisbon, and a Canadian told me that I have quite a British accent, which I was like, really? No way, come on. but yeah,
you've been here too long.
Yeah.
Well, it's great to have you. And then finally, last but not least, Max from White People.
So yeah, I'm Max Vaughan. Along with my wife, we set up White Peat Distillery in Derbyshire, just on the southern edge of the Peak District in 2016. We started making whiskey in Easter of 2018, so it kind of took us about 18 months to salvage these buildings we're in. And we make a lightly peated single malt. That's our core expression. We launched our first whiskey in February this year. So yeah, we're into the happy times of having some bottled whiskey out in the market, which is great. And we're based at a former wireworks, which dates back to the 1870s. We're in a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And certainly a lot of what we do, and we'll come on to talk about it, is kind of informed by this place. We've got a very kind of strong sense of where we're making whiskey and how that has a bearing on what we do day to day.
Excellent. Thanks very much for being with us. So before we get on to the specific topics that I want to cover today, as I guess like an overview, modern English whisky turns 15 years old this year, with the English Whisky Company from Norfolk turning 15, hopefully releasing something with a nice double-digit number on it. Do you feel like English whisky is still quite a niche, quite a sort of, its own small side pocket of whisky, or do you feel like English whisky is starting to break through into the kind of the mainstream whisky world? How do you guys feel about that? Abby, I'll throw that to you first.
Good question. I know when we came back to England to build the distillery, and then we were just in the throes of setting up the business, an article came out in GQ magazine which said, "Oh my goodness, did you know there are 5 English whisky distilleries? Isn't this incredible?" And I thought, well, no, because I can count 12 off the top of my head, which I know of. So I thought we just can't have this. Like, we really need to raise the profile of English whisky and just kind of get it out there, get it known, so that, drinkers can start following the journey of these new distilleries, which are making, but just haven't, got sort of product into bottle yet. So we created the English Whisky Map, just knocked it up literally overnight as quickly as we could, just to share it so that the information was there in response to this article. And since then, we have just grown and grown, and more distilleries and more whiskey on the shelf now. So I think we are way past that, kind of very small, obviously in terms of whiskey industry, it is still in its early days, but yeah, I think we've broken through. We've reached kind of mainstream, and we're starting to pick up drinkers on a global scale now as well. So yeah, really exciting time to be in English whisky.
Max, I'm actually going to come to you next, because you've obviously just released your first whisky. How was that as an experience? Did you feel like people took you seriously, working with the trade, working, in that side of things? Or, do you still feel like you rely heavily on your founders and supporters, to get your products out there to market? Oh, you're on mute, by the way. It was inevitable. Yeah,
I think both in some ways, Rich. Certainly for our first release, I guess the groundswell that we got from our social media followers, from our mailing list, from our various supporters, people who have been to do distillery tours, that definitely helped. And I think, kind of to echo some of the comments that Abby made, I think sometimes it's difficult, right, when you're heavily invested in all ways in a sector, to see what it looks like from 50,000 feet. But I think certainly for us, given that we are relatively small distillery in relatively small volumes, there's certainly a universe out there of people who care about how whiskey is being made, where it's being made, who's making it. And so we have been, I guess we benefited from, that consumer, that, that kind of conscious consumer that has those kind of, I guess, interests in spirits and in whiskey. But I think on the wider scale, in terms of the trade, our first 2 releases have all been domestic, but we've had enormous support from a wide range of trade partners. But again, I think it does come back to the spirit being good and being able to, I guess, communicate what it is that is unique or different about the whiskey that you're making. And I think at the moment we are, on our scale, we are appealing to a community of people who care about all those things. I think the challenge for for the sector is to, if it wants to grow and branch out beyond that, is to, I guess, is find ways of kind of cutting through some of those more traditional views about where whiskey should come from. And I'll give you one example. I was in Holland last week, And I went to see a really nice guy, owns a whiskey shop. Well, I won't tell you where, but it's been in his family for generations. And he gave me some kind of lovely advice on his view on the scene in the Netherlands. But he said, no one comes into my shop, Max, to buy whiskey unless it's from Scotland or Ireland. So, you know, that's a kind of barrier that I think we are breaking down, but I think it still exists.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Chico, a point that I guess is quite relevant to Oxford Artisan Distillery, all of the things that you guys do to produce these whiskies of such high quality and at such a young age does make them maybe less price competitive than, say, a 12-year-old Scotch. So how do you feel that that is perceived? You know, you've been around the longest, you've got the most products out. How is that kind of craft artisan space, how does that work for you when it comes to sort of pricing and how people then perceive that product as something that is very small batch and exclusive?
Yeah, I think in general, when people see a young whiskey, let's say 3-4 years old, costing the same as probably a 20 years old Scotch, of course that's not seen in a good way. But it's so when you start to dive in the how the whiskey was made, with all the ingredients, the attention to the detail that was put in the whiskey, I think some people might really understand that. The way I view English whiskey is that, I mean, there is not a strong tradition as in Scotland. And of course, the stock of English whiskey cannot be as old on that level. But because it's such a new kind of wave, we are writing our own history. Well, phrasing a little bit what we've been saying, I think that there's a public out there that is really looking into English whiskey in a good way. I mean, might be because we're pushing the boundaries forward, doing different things. For example, using casks that probably will not be allowed to use in Scotland. We definitely have more freedom in a way, freedom. That might not be on the legal terms, but might be on breaking the boundaries of tradition. And for a public that really appreciate to taste something new and have different experiences through the products that they consume, I think it's a golden time to be an English distiller. The way I like to see it is probably in a few years going to other country and people could say exactly what the English kind of style of whiskey is, as we have kind of the Scotch kind of style. And I mean, we're doing so many different whiskies. I mean, not only single malts, but rye whiskies, wheat whiskies, being produced in so many distilleries. So to the pricing point, I think also comes the scarcity in place. Is we're very small niche. Of course, we're not producing let's say I don't know, 30 casks a day or 30 casks a week. But might come to a point that we actually have enough inventory and we can reduce the cost of our production. So we deliver whiskey that might be more affordable. And I think at least in Oxford, that's our goal, is that whiskey should be enjoyed by everyone. But of course, we need to pay our bills. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, scale is obviously a huge factor in pricing any product. But let's dive into the component parts that make your whiskies the quality and you know the sought after product that they are. So the first one I want to touch on is ingredients. Let's actually stay with you, Chico, because this is so obviously relevant to what you do at Oxford Artisan Distillery. if I was setting up a distillery tomorrow, I could go and buy commercially available barley, which is obviously produced for high yield. I could then go and source, distiller's yeast, commercially available distiller's yeast. When it comes to the ingredients that you're working with, what decisions did you take to create a product that you wanted to stand out within the market, and why did you make those decisions?
Well, the decisions are made mainly with two factors, which is flavor and sustainability. Sustainability is in our core, and we like to source our ingredients in the most sustainable way possible, which in my opinion, is directly related with flavor. So when you take an ingredient that was grown naturally in a condition that the nature was healthy, it's you can taste the difference of the grain. For example, a grain that grows in a field that is not being sprayed with the fertilizers, pumped with chemicals. Maybe, I mean, in the drier countries might have some water as well. Compared with the grain that was naturally grown and that might not have so much access to water and to fertilizer, the natural grain will be way denser, will be richer, more dense in nutrients, in proteins, carbohydrates, that will translate overall in more flavor, because you might use the same amount of grain, let's say 1 ton of barley, but if you use 1 ton of barley that was grown with fertilizer and pumped with a lot of help to get bigger, that same 1 ton will have less kind of substance in it. We like to see ourselves, as we are distillers, we also like to see us as farmers. So we grow all our grains, so we don't buy grain in pretty much. And we grow all our grains with 8 farmers locally. And all the grains we grow are, they are not commercially available. Actually, we cannot sell our grain. So we work with our head of farming and sustainability, John Letts, which it's an archaeobotanist by trade, which spent over 2 decades studying and collecting Asian varieties of every single grain he could find. He worked in thatch roofs. He was a plant breeder back in Canada, but he started to collect weird and very rare varieties of barley, wheat, rye from gene banks all over the world, and start to grow them as they used to be grown back in medieval ages, Neolithic, and back in those days, people were not just like, oh, this is X variety of barley. No, they just have a sack of cereals. They just broadcast it and then see what happens. So there was basically a population of grains growing in a field that really worked as they used to be grown in the past. I mean, grains are wild grasses that were domesticated. But as we humans live in a society, and we're a population of a city, for example, or a village, there's a lot of diversity. And diversity is key, because diversity brings resilience. And for example, if you have a field of just one variety of grain, might there be a bug that really likes that grain and just comes to this paradise, and it just becomes a pest. But if there's several varieties of grain, other grains might attract other bugs that might eat that bug. So there's an ecosystem going on in the field, and we don't see any insect or any animal or fungi or anything like as a pest, we always see it as part of the ecosystem. So that's very important for us.
I'm going to stop you there just for a second, actually. But it is really fascinating, and I can attest for the fact that your whiskies really do deliver that complexity of flavour because of those ingredients. And I guess an analogy would be your kind of heritage tomatoes at a farmer's market versus your kind of mass-produced supermarket tomato, which, you know, my mum's always saying, oh, they don't taste of anything. So I say, stop buying them. But yeah. Just moving to the next stage. Well, actually, Max, you've just started working with local barley, actually. So let me come to you next. But what I really wanted to get onto with you is your yeast. But I'll let you sort of segue with the barley, because that's a really interesting story.
Yeah, so yeah, I guess it was interesting. I think amongst all the producers that I'm kind of familiar with in the English whiskey scene, is there's a focus on quality and flavour, but that means different things to different people. And yeah, for sure, for us, yeast and fermentation is a major focus. But just to carry on the conversation on grain, yeah, we essentially 10 months of the year we typically produce our similar style house spirit, and then 2 months of the year on average we do something slightly different. So this year in February we used an unpeated malt from a local farmer that comes from about 10 miles from here, and it was the second attempt, right? The first time we tried, yeah, partly because of what he'd grown in the ground before, the barley that we were trying to collaborate with him, we had a crop that had too much nitrogen in it, so it took us a couple of attempts to get it right. But yeah, this year we spent all of February producing single malt with local malt, and that was lovely. And I can attest to the fact that you walk in the distillery every day, and it's typically, certainly in our distillery, the kind of the mashing and fermentation aromas that you can smell, and it smelled very different in February than it typically does do. So there's definitely some different flavor, some different variety that we're getting from that local barley. So that was a really interesting thing for us to do. We're going to do something similar again later this year. And in the past we've done sort of monthly campaigns where we're making whiskey. It's not single malt, but we're using dark malts, chocolate malts, oats, and this is a collaboration that we're sort of generally working on sort of week in, week out with the brewing sector in Derbyshire. So that particular mash bill I was talking about was something that we put together with a local brewery and with their head brewer, and those kind of things make life interesting, right? I mean, we started this distillery to make great whiskey. We also want it to be fun and interesting for everyone that works here. So I think that I guess we're going to come on to things like experimentation, but it's part of the day-to-day here.
And you mentioned the brewers, and there's a connection there with the yeast, isn't there? So you're not just purchasing a commercially available yeast. So do you want to tell us how that works with your distillery?
Yeah, so I mean, just early on, we thought about what is it that's going to be different about this whiskey that we're making or planning to make in Derbyshire, and whiskey never been made before in this region. Beer has been made here for hundreds of years, so it was kind of an interesting area to start looking at. Is there an aspect of that brewing heritage that we can build in? And and as we all know, you start making whiskey by making beer, and we can call it different things, but essentially that's what you do. And so we were reaching out to local breweries in sort of 2017 when we were doing lots of R&D, and asking them just to crop some of their, I guess, live spent yeast as far as they're concerned, but still has some veracity. And we were trying different kind of blends using live yeast and some traditional dry distiller's yeast, and we just identified, in our view, that we were coming up with some really interesting flavors, allied with length of fermentation, of course. And for us, we just thought, look, this is something that we like. It ties what we're doing to this locality, and it gives some provenance to our Derbyshire whiskey. And so, wind forward the clock, every single litre of the nearly 200,000 litres of pure alcohol we've ever made has been made with live yeast actually from Thornbridge Brewery in the Peak District. So we collect live yeast from them every single week, and we do pitch that with some dry distiller's yeast for fermentation.
That's fantastic. I mean, it always reminds me of kind of people sharing sourdough starter during lockdown and
yeah.
Keeping the dream alive. Abby, to come to you, obviously one of your main focuses and passions at Cooper King is sustainability. When it comes to ingredients, is that as simple as kind of the miles that something travels, or the way it's grown in the ground? What are the complexities of sourcing when you're trying to be a kind of a carbon neutral, even carbon negative spirit?
Yeah, it's challenging, and there's so many different aspects to consider. It's not just as easy as local is best, because it isn't always. So it's always a battle between trying to reduce the food miles and therefore the carbon footprint versus flavour and quality. So there's always, there is often a trade-off. Like, for example, with our gin and our neutral spirits. So we buy that in, and we get it from a local distillery, and it's all sourced from local wheat, which is fantastic. We have looked at moving to organic spirit, but that would mean sourcing it from overseas, which at the moment we're not willing to do. So you always have, there's so many things to factor in. For us, in terms of the whiskey and the grain, so we use a heritage grain, Maris Otter. So we use a heritage grain with a distiller's yeast, so that's our combination in terms of the ingredients. And with the grain, at the moment it comes from Yorkshire. Well, it's all UK sourced, mainly from Yorkshire, and we last year partnered with, or a couple of years ago, partnered with a couple of local farms. So we wanted to really hone into the traceability, so that our grain could come from distinct farms, the continual supply. However, we very quickly learned of the challenges of that. So if you try and pin down a very particular source, and we're not farmers ourselves, so we do rely on other farmers, that you are so susceptible to the elements and climate change and seasonality. So harvest was not good enough for us to source all of our grain from those farmers, so it was mixed with other Yorkshire grain. But it does make you acutely aware of this is an agricultural product. We are making product, whiskey from grain which has to be grown. So you have to become intimately aware of the growers and the challenges which they face. So in terms of sustainability, it really opens your eyes to just how intricately linked climate health, planet health is with food production. You can't get around it. Soil health, the quality of the food that we eat and that we produce our product with, it's all so important. So for us, in terms of future, we would like to work with specific farms to source our grain. We would love to work with regenerative farmers, to move to that low intensity, more traditional farming techniques, a bit like kind of Toad, a pioneering, and Spirit of Yorkshire pioneering as well. So it'd be great to kind of put it with those and really learn from them as to how, because that, to me, that's, in terms of our production, that's the way that we're looking to move to.
It kind of brings me on to my next point anyway, and Matt's touched on it slightly in terms of talking about Derbyshire whiskey, but there has been conversation in recent years in the whiskey world around the idea of terroir and the idea of not just a whiskey produced in a location, but the impact of that location on the whiskey. Do you think that, you know, if you were producing in just those farms, in those locales, you could actually sort of pick up the uniqueness of a grain grown on that field as opposed to that field? You know, or are there elements of the way you do things that you feel are creating whiskey's own sense of terroir that gives you that sense of place without necessarily it being the same, lifted from the kind of French interpretation of the word? I'll go straight back to you, Abby, on that, because I think it's really interesting. Oh
yeah, so that's really interesting. I think terroir is quite a controversial subject. Some people argue blind that it doesn't matter. Other people will argue the opposite. For me, I think it certainly can exist. But I think the challenge is with when you look at two different grains, you know, we can distill those into new make. We may or may not see some slight differences, and you think, well, you know, is that enough to really warrant putting these two different, you know, products in a bottle at the end of maturation? But we must remember that maturation will magnify those differences that you see in the spirit. So whilst on the face of it, when you're just looking at two new makes, you might think, I'm not sure, you know, in 5-10 years time, that could be a big difference. But that's the challenge with whiskey. It's slow, it makes you wait, and you have to be patient. So experiments, you know, can be 10-20 years down the line before we really have an answer. I think ultimately, as a producer, if that's what excites you and you think that that's enough of a difference for you to want to champion that, then great. Obviously, you have to bear in mind that customers might not buy into that, or, you know, but I definitely believe that grain is hugely important. Whether it matters that it comes from one particular field, you know, on a different side with a bit more sun, that I don't know, I can't say, but other people have. And if customers, you know, it adds variety, and I think it's a great conversation. But yeah, that's my input.
You'll give us your full answer in 20 years when you're experimenting.
Exactly. Yeah, when I've done my own experiment. Exactly.
Max, I guess a kind of counterpoint to that is obviously some people will argue that the cask plays such a massive role in the eventual flavour of a whiskey. But then even the cask itself, you know, where it's stored, you know, how it's stored, you've got quite a unique setup in that you've got all of your casks on site there. How do you feel that adds to that sense of whiskey terroir by being able to control every aspect of your process all the way through maturation?
Yeah, look, it's really important for us. It's, you know, it's one of the reasons why we're on this site. And yeah, we'd certainly broaden out the discussion around terroir and provenance to, you know, and multiple factors that are going to have a bearing on the bottled whiskey in years to come, depending on what you focus on. And for us, yeah, absolutely. All of our whiskey spends its entire life cycle, and will do, here at the Wireworks. And you know, we're on the banks of the River Derwent. We back into an ancient woodland, and you know, if we could walk around the still house with a camera, I can show you, you know, a whole load of interesting stuff growing on our walls that is a function, for example, of the live yeast that exist in this woodland location. And, you know, on that, all of our fermentations, you know, they are open to that atmosphere. So there's just kind of two things: the atmosphere we're in, the kind of microclimate, for, I guess, the production phase, you know, those 7 days where we're actually making the new make spirit, but then also the bearing that's going to have during the life cycle of the whiskey, during maturation. So yeah, absolutely. That for us, you know, absolutely key to what we kind of set out to do here. And the wood is, you know, no one's going to argue that's not important. I think our focus, and I think it's the same for, you know, most of the distilleries I know on the English scene, is putting your heart and soul into the new make spirit. In that, I guess there's that period where you're the level of active input is greatest, is really important. So that what goes into the cask on day one is, you know, the best spirit you can make, or, you know, has those characteristics that, you know, in our case, shine a light on Derbyshire, which are really important. And then, of course, the environment is going to spend, you know, whatever it is, 3, 4, 5, you know, years further, is going to have a significant bearing. So selecting, I think, those casks is important. And, you know, I think there's a danger that you know, of selecting casks just for the sake of having variety. I read a great blog the other day, and it was just echoing that point, that the cask selection for the spirit that you're making and the style of whiskey you want to put in bottle is important. So, you know, just because you can buy 20 different varieties of casks, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to sort of suit the spirit you're making or the style you want to bottle. But for sure, you know, the wood's important, and so I think is the program about selection. And we source all our casks, you know, direct from either cooperages or distilleries, and having that kind of connection and understanding the provenance of those casks, again, is important to us.
While we're talking casks very quickly, actually, so one of the, I guess, tools in the arsenal of a new craft distillery in terms of releasing whiskey at a younger age and really kind of amplifying that flavour are these casks like the Jim Swan STR cask. And I know, Abby, you guys are working with a similar type of thing. How much do you kind of have to rely on, I don't want to call them tricks, but, you know, because they're not, you know, it's a technique and it's a craft, but how much, when you know you want to release early, how much do you rely on things like an STR or a NEOC and those casks that allow you, or even quarter casks, or, you know, I know for Chico, some of the more powerfully flavored fortified wine casks, for instance, how much do you kind of bake that into your planning, knowing that you want to release at a young age? Chico, we might as well come to you on that. How important is that in terms of creating something that you will feel comfortable putting to market, you know, that doesn't have a 12-year age statement on it?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to releasing a young whiskey, I see it as we need to shape every stage of the process to deliver that. From the grain you use, the yeast, the fermentation profile, distillation, and of course maturation. When we talk about young whiskey that matures for 3-4 years, we need to look at the maturation in a sense that there are ups and downs in the whiskey maturation, in the cask life. The cask might taste completely different in the summer than it tastes in the winter. Sourcing the cask is very important to have either beautiful virgin oak. STRs work really well because of the composition of the wood and the being such a old cask itself with a nice toast and char sometimes. We play with wine casks that I mean, we play from light to very heavy wine influenced casks, but those help us to bring more flavor that can pair with the character of a young whiskey in a good way. Also, for example, the ABV that you're maturing is very important. It should match with your kind of warehouse style, as Max was and you were describing. We have different warehouses. We have warehouses that are exposed to the local climates big time because the gates are always open, so the casks are exposed to hot sunny days, to freezing cold weather, and there's a lot of reactions and movements inside the cask. The liquid penetrates the wood. It comes out when it contracts and extracts a lot of flavor. The chemicals that react within the liquid, it's probably the most important and perhaps most difficult reactions to kind of promote, but that can be promoted with certain levels of temperature, humidity, and of course the new make that you put in there. It should have kind of all the ingredients in a chemical sense to kind of start to break down, to bond, and and of course evaporation is very important. I have a huge debate with my CFO, because he's like, "Oh, our entry chart it's massive, like I mean 12% sometimes," and I was like, "Well, yeah, but this is also important. I mean, you might evaporate a lot, but we need to remember that also some of that liquid is concentrating as well. It might be evaporating lighter molecules that are not so pleasant, and we really need to get rid of it. Sizes can be important as well, as when you reduce the size of a cask, you increase the surface contact area. But of course, we don't want to overpower the flavor of the whiskey with the maturation, because then we lose the character of the spirit itself, the new make. But it's about trying to find that nice balance between the spirit, between the grain character, the fermentation character, the distillation character, and pair it with the cask profile. So we might use, let's say, smaller casks, but they will be always blended with bigger casks. So we have kind of a nice blend in the end. But I guess that all these factors also play or are related with the word terroir, which I really like, and here we are all about terroir in a way. But the where you mature the casks that impact the flavor. The people that work in the distilleries that select these casks specifically also have an impact, because if the professionals there were different and picking the other casks, the flavor will be different as well. The stills contributing with some specific notes. It's a very nice symbiosis of flavor chemistry that can happen with maturation. On a young whiskey, I think, of course, the time that the maturation can impact the flavor is shorter. I think we are focusing in trying to deliver as much as possible during that short period. So in a way, we give everything we can during those. I mean, in a football match, we'll be like giving, like running, like, and just like really like playing hard. So we for example, we sample the casks very often, and we might take very quick decisions in what we were trying to approach. We have a quite extensive cask inventory with a lot of different styles of casks, with a lot of different styles of whiskies, of course, different mash bills, but same mash bills distilled in different ways: pot distilled, column distilled, distilled twice or three times. And pairing that new make style with the cask style is really, really important, because as Max was saying, well, we need to. Having a very unique cask might not pair that well with the new make that you're maturing. So that's really important, and sometimes depends what you are thinking for that whiskey in particular. For example, we'll be releasing a whiskey in the future that I probably should not talk too much about, but it's a whiskey that will express a lot of specific wood character. I'm not talking about oak. I'm talking about something else. And in the journey of maturing that whiskey, it's probably the whiskey probably started in a ex wine cask, and the new make worked quite well with that wine cask that was picked for that new make. But then, as we picked that cask to do this release, we want to introduce some flavors that are not so usual in the whiskey world. So therefore, we got a super heavy charred cask to kind of polish a little bit of sulfury edge that we got in that cask, but give the wood complexity that we were looking for. We're not looking for like vanilla or coconut or classic oak character, but we're looking for some like kind of like cedar smoke, pine, a bit of juniper. But that's in the end when paired with the liquid that came from a wine cask, it just came into kind of like citrusy spruce shoots, and so it's kind of like this developing of evolving of flavors that us distillers that mature whiskey for such a short time are really focused on.
You've almost answered my next question, which I'm going to come on to very shortly. But just on the topic of casks, Abby, and I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but the Neok cask, which is similar to the STR, why did you choose not to use the STR, which is presumably widely available? What made you make that decision? Was it because of your spirit and how you thought it would interact with the wood?
Yeah, I was really interested to. So the difference with the Neok is they are. So it's predominantly Bordeaux wine, toasted, so without that sort of heavy char. So I've been looking at different toast levels, different char levels, and predominantly looking at the difference between American oak and European oak. So we've got quite the maturation warehouse is pretty much divided down the middle between kind of French wine, Cognac, Armagnac, and American barrels from our sort of Kentucky supply. Bourbon. So yeah, we chose that because I mean it's a long experiment, and it's to find which type of cask best fits our spirit. So what we're finding that, and they're kind of doing almost the exact opposite of what I had expected. I thought that, you know, the French would be a bit slow, you know, the wine casks would be quite slow to mature, but they're actually maturing quite well. I thought the flavor would be a bit more subtle, it would be kind of softer, more elegant, but actually it's, you know, it's quite rich, it's quite full on. We're getting loads of complexity in that, but still just nicely balanced with the signature, you know, flavor profile of the spirit. So it is working really well in that respect. And I think we're lucky now as small producers that we can source some really fantastic casks. So although, you know, it's good to get lots of casks coming into the warehouse and get them filled, I think if you can, for other distilleries out there, if you have the time and the resources to find some direct supplies, you know, to pair up with vineyards or other distilleries, to really work on establishing those relationships, to get those, you know, slightly more unique casks, or to, you know, to have the time to find ones which do pair well with your spirit, you know, never kind of overlook that, because you always want to find the balance between, you know, the wood and what the wood brings versus your house character, your flavor profile, which is unique to you and that nobody else can replicate. You know, anybody else can buy the same casks as you, but it's your pairing which is going to make that spirit unique. So that's super important. And, you know, in terms of us for experimentation of casks, each one of our casks, although we might not necessarily know what flavor we're going to get, has still been carefully chosen so that that spirit is still well worth putting into a bottle at the end of it. You know, there's no point just kind of spreading yourself too thin and putting stuff in casks without really knowing what the main purpose is, because you'll just end up with loads of whiskey that maybe isn't good enough to go into bottle, or, you know, you have to double up and put it in another cask. So I would say, but then I'm a scientist, so I'm always going to be super critical and analytical, very cautious. I think just, you know, choose your casks wisely if you can. Don't be afraid to experiment, but just make sure that there's a reason. You know, what are you hoping to get at the end of it? Otherwise, I think you just run yourself ragged.
I have exactly the same view, but usually I also say that the way I see our cask maturation is, or our maturation program is like a library of flavors. So having a diverse range of new makes, and then a diverse range of casks, you are matching and creating more flavors that one day you can do like a blend in a way that you always kind of like imagine about, or you never thought about as well. But of course, there's always a danger of ending up, as you said Abby, to end up with just like so much whiskey that you don't know what to do with.
But yeah, you're right. That is the blending aspect. You know, then that is a reason to have a good, you know, portfolio of cask types in there, so you can pull and you can mix. You know, we're looking at different casks at the moment. Well, what, you know, this is bringing us these different elements in terms of flavor profile, but actually what it's lacking, you know, is this. So can we overlap those casks? Can we blend? Can we, you know, vat those together and just give it that extra level of complexity? So yeah, the swings and roundabouts.
I like the fact that you're both doing the same thing, but in two completely different ways. I think Abby would have a heart attack if she was spent a day in Chico's world, and I'm not sure Chico could be restrained enough to spend a day in Abby. Yeah. Maybe that's an experiment in itself. But Max, what's your sense of experimentation there? Because I think you've got a very clear vision about what you want your whiskey to be. Are you experimenting with casks? I mean, obviously you've been experimenting with your mash bill, but what does experimentation mean for you? And is there anything that we should be looking out for on the horizon?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, first off, we felt like we owed it to ourselves to understand how our spirit behaves in, you know, different wood environments, you know, as Abby and Chico have mentioned. So you know, the best time to I guess take, you know, some of those decisions, and this is a voyage of discovery, right? As Abby's mentioned, the feedback loop is extremely long, but certainly, you know, we would advocate, you know, not being too kind of conservative early on, because, you know, you start to get those results over time, and then you can make kind of more informed decisions, for example, about what cask you're going to buy next time around. And we've certainly been through this process. So, you know, we have about 6 different varieties of STR cask. Some of them have got combinations of American and European oak, different toast levels, different char levels. You know, and I can tell you there was one particular variety 12 months in, I did not like it, so I didn't order anymore. 2 years in, I loved it, and I wish I'd ordered some more the previous time we'd ordered. So, you know, Chico mentioned that, you know, there is this kind of roller coaster over time on the cask activity. But I think the other thing around casks that we found really interesting is, you know, and if we step back to when we started, we were doing things that were quite different to, let's say, the, you know, established way of making whiskey. We're using some of the, you know, the same equipment. You know, we're using a pot still, but that's been designed to, it's been fabricated to our design. You know, same with our fermentation vessels. They've got certain physical features which are to our design. But, you know, fundamentally, it's a kind of batch pot distillation process. And we didn't necessarily want to reinvent every single spoke of the wheel. So we started filling our casks at 63.5% ABV, which is the industry standard. We no longer do that. Because once we sort of built up a little bit more courage to start looking at things differently, we're filling our casks at a fill ABV that starts at 70 and it comes all the way down to the low 50s. And you could have exactly the same cask, and when you put different strength spirit in, you're going to end up with a different whiskey in the future. So that's just, you know, another set of parameters that you can play with, and certainly something that we feel, you know, very strongly about in terms of how is that strength of spirit going to have a bearing on the wood extract. And certainly when you get round, as we're just getting to now, the second time of use, and we are, you know, we have got some refills now in our warehouse because we've done 2 releases. You know, those are considerations for that sort of second time of filling, which are, you know, certainly worth bearing in mind. So, so there's, you know, that aspect just, you know, the permutations are enormous. And then I think of people have spoken to already, you know, there's the opportunity to finish in different cask styles, to, you know, maybe mature for a period of time at a certain ABV, vat the contents, cut the spirit back a bit and put it back in those casks. You know, that's something we can do in England. And again, it's not necessarily sort of finishing in a different cask, it's sort of looking at the ABV differently. And I think all of those things are what makes the kind of the job of making whiskey really interesting. And I think we've become probably more expansive as we've got more comfortable with our house style of spirit and how it's behaving in different environments. And now we have got whiskey out there, and the feedback's been great, and it probably just encourages you maybe at the margins to try a few different things. And it may well be that in 5 years' time, some of the things we've tried, you know, are a miss and some are a hit. But if you don't try, you don't know.
I mean, it sounds like it's an absolute rabbit hole of, you know, potential roads that you can go down, and you could get very lost. Really quick yes or no answer from each of you. Do you have a single focal point of your vision for your whiskey, and every experiment helps you get there? Or does that focal point shift because of the experiment? So Max, just a yes or no.
Yes.
Focal point. You're already, you know where you're heading. Yeah. Chico?
Yeah.
Well, we see our experimentation is really...
Keep it short, keep it short.
All right, so what? Yes and no.
Go on, Abby, top that.
I would say yes, but
no.
But this is pre, you know, whiskey release. Yeah. I think in the future that will shift.
No, it's really interesting. And look, you know, in 10 years' time, let's have this conversation again and see if you're still, you know, sticking to that same focal point, or if it's shifted entirely for things that you can't control. But I guess that's the point, is you have to control yourself, or you could end up just experimenting and then never having something that you can call your whiskey. So so many variables, so many things to consider. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. The next topic is one that Max almost mentioned, actually. I feel like you're teeing me up for these questions, guys, so thank you for helping out. But you talked about, in England, things being allowed. The next topic is regulation. Obviously, currently, English whiskey only really has to adhere to 3 or 4 very simple rules as laid out by the EU, which is obviously very different to Scotch, which has a very substantive set of regulations. Is that a help or a hindrance, first of all? So do you feel like the freedom and the lack of regulation is a benefit to English whiskey right now? Abby, I'll come back to you on that one.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because you know, as whiskey drinkers, you expect a certain, you know, level of, or you expect certain things from a whiskey. So you know, you'll expect it to be made from certain grain in a certain way, using a certain process, so that you kind of know what you're going to get, and you'll expect different products, different styles from different countries based on each country's regulation. So I think some of the, you know, and Scotland have very strict regulation, which has worked fantastically for them, because they have, you know, really honed what is Scotch. People know what is Scotch, they know what to expect. However, the flip side of that is that, you know, it has been criticised for stifling innovation and for really restricting, you know, the expansion in the category, and for kind of reducing that variety. As a drinker, you always want variety, you know, and as producers, you want to be creative and really, you know, want to kind of push the boundaries of what you can produce. So England has that unique opportunity where the industry is young. We look to kind of Scotch, we look to the more established industries and kind of learn from them. So what can we bring? You know, do we want to regulate English whiskey? What, you know, and what as a consumer, what do we want them to expect from a bottle of English whiskey? So we've just recently introduced, you know, we've put in for a GI to protect what English whiskey is. And the purpose of that is to just kind of meet what we feel is certain criteria. So if you pick up a bottle of English whiskey, you don't want to later discover that it's been, you know, made from grain in Germany, distilled in France, and the only thing English about it is the headquarters on the bottle. So you want to know that it's made from English grain, or it's been distilled in England, it's been, you know, mashed, fermented, matured in England and bottled, you know. So it's really just about establishing the provenance of that product, but without stifling innovation, creativity, and, you know, allowing that category to expand.
Absolutely, and obviously, I guess there's a lot of things happening globally in whiskey that wouldn't necessarily be allowed in Scotland. So certain types of still, certain processes, and yeah, I guess from a purely selfish consumer point of view, I do want there to be that innovation and to try things, but I also want, like you said, to know that it genuinely comes from England and it adheres to those principles. So you've got that base quality.
Look at Japan as well. You know, recently they've just had to establish what is Japanese whiskey, because until now it's been a blend, or you know, some of it has been a blend of Scotch and Japanese whiskey. You know, it's like, yeah, so it's confusing for the customer, I think. So yeah, a good old bottle of Ben Nicker.
Max, what's your take on this, and do you have confidence that we're at a stage where consumers are demanding that level of quality and consistency and regulation within the English industry?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and just following on from what, you know, Abby said, you know, they've been making whiskey in Japan for, you know, I'm going to get this totally wrong, but something like 7 decades. And kind of it's interesting that there's almost been a bit of a kind of Wild West in terms of what you can do out there, but they've taken a decision to try and redefine what it means to be a Japanese whiskey. And I think what's been really encouraging for us is the willingness of the distilleries in England to get together and have a conversation and think about these things early on. And it's not easy. There's always going to be, at some point, there will be some tension between trying to uphold quality standards and give the consumer some confidence about what they're buying. There's going to be some tension between those things and, you know, creativity at the extreme. So it's not going to be perfect for everybody all of the time. But certainly, I think what we're setting out to do is to be as inclusive as possible, but also just kind of fundamentally uphold what it means to be made in England. And, you know, different people have different ideas about how to define that. But I do think, you know, coming to the second part of your question, that the whiskey consumer, and I think consumers in general, are caring more, certainly a bigger proportion of consumers, about the decisions they're making about the food they buy, the drink they buy, what they know about it. And I think we're kind of, the English whiskey scene is growing at a time when those the level of consumer interest in those types of things is growing. And I think it's a good time for us to be, sort of grasping the nettle and trying to, you know, put together this GI, which we have done, to try and, you know, underpin some of those values that we think are going to be important going forward.
And just for anyone watching who isn't aware, there is an English Whisky Guild now. So when Max and Abby are referring to we, obviously they speak, as English whisky distillers, but there is actually a formal English Whisky Guild which has submitted this GI to DEFRA. So obviously, if you're thinking of producing English whisky, that might be a good place to start and get advice and join that discussion. But Chico, obviously, you guys have been very heavily involved in that process as well. As an experimental distillery, experimentation is in your DNA. Do you feel comfortable, putting these regulations down? Do you feel like, you're still leaving a pathway for the next experimental distillery behind you to be able to have the freedoms that you've had since starting?
Well, I think the GI should, well, I mean, it defines what whiskey is and what whiskey can be as well, in a way. And we are totally comfortable with that, because whiskey for us means a specific thing. But then, I mean, what, for example, now probably going to start to see, probably not from us, but maybe like whiskey being infused with botanicals, and I mean, I don't know, I'm not sure what we can call to that in a way, but maybe you cannot call it whiskey. But I know some distillers that are like working with this, but they are not so sure what to do with it in a way. But they really want to work the whiskey with some botanicals, for example. But as a whiskey, whiskey, it's, I mean, for us, we are looking more into experimenting with grains, different grains like black oats, einkorn, amber spelt, and experimenting with every single stage of the process. So we are very comfortable with just going. I mean, in my opinion, there's so much variables that can be explored, and are still to be explored in the whiskey world, and also in the traditional kind of conventional whiskey production, that I don't think we will get bored with that. I mean, for example, here we take the aspect of being grain to glass quite literally. So the way I see our production is to try to translate as much as possible the character of the grain in the spirits, and for that, every single step of the process is optimized and thought about. For example, we don't separate the grain from the liquid, and so we ferment with the grain in, and we distill with the grain in, delivering a different style of whiskey compared with single malt, for example. We have a fermentation profile that we use quite nice distiller's yeast, although we allow the grain to express its wild microflora, mainly bacteria. We between mashing and fermentation, we have a period of time that we promote the incubation of the wild lactic acid bacteria that comes from the grain, usually, and then fermenting in oak vats that add a period of grace to the wild yeast to develop before we, as a commercialist, allows more kind of the grain itself to shine through the fermentation as well. And of course, I mean, when I look to our stills, they seem a bit odd sometimes. The columns, I mean, the columns there are designed in a way that, although they are rectifying and bubbling, they are designed in a way that carry the flavor through the distillation. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, our vodka is so flavorful, but it's still distilled at 96.4%. So we will keep experimenting with different grains, with trying to optimize the flavor of the grain in the spirits and pairing with different casks. But of course, there's, I mean, probably should be like kind of like a borderline to where you can go to. For example, I mean, if you want to start to experiment with, I mean, actually, for example, I was reading this book the other day. I don't know if I have mentioned this before to you, Richard, or not, but I was reading this book on manipulating fires. So using like orange zest in the fire to give kind of like mulled wine, spices, kind of aroma, and all that. And well, I was starting to think, well, maybe we can dry or kill our grain or malt with these kind of fires. So we kind of like, it's a different way to introduce the flavor you were looking for. So I think when it comes to imagination or creativity, there are no limits. We just need to be creative. How introduce these kind of ideas in a way that we still protect the integrity of a whiskey.
Yeah, well, I think Max is going to start throwing dried orange zest onto his campfires up in the woods that they do just to experiment. So I'm sure he'll feedback on that. Guys, I really appreciate all the time you've given. Final question, and then I'll let you get back to doing what you do best, which is making amazing whiskey and spirits. We are at 15 years in modern English whiskey history. In another 15 years, when the category is essentially 30 years old, some of you will then have 15 or older whiskies, and there might potentially be a 30-year-old English whiskey on the market. How do you think you'll look back on the now? Max, you've just released your first whiskey. Abby, that's very soon to happen for you guys. Chico, obviously, you've released, but you're experimenting, and you don't necessarily have that one singular house style. How do you feel you'll look back on today? And do you think you'll look back and kind of go, oh, why did we do that? Or, do you think actually you'll have kind of doubled down on those things and you'll just be in a place where you've got a much clearer vision of what you're doing? And what are your hopes and sort of potentially fears for the future as an industry and as distilleries? Max, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly, I'll back and sort of, we won't have got everything right. It might just be on the basis of what we personally view about our distillery and the spirits we're making. But I guess fundamentally, I hope I'll be looking back and kind of seeing distilleries, the kind of English whiskey scene, behaving still like they're the kind of new kids on the block. And I think as long as we have that focus on flavor and creativity and don't consider ourselves to be sort of established, quote unquote, whatever that means, then I think that augurs well for the long term for the sector.
Abby?
Yeah, I like that. I mean, we all bring so many different things to the table, and I think if we continue as we are, it's going to be a really exciting time. Yeah, I think we will always consider ourselves the new kids on the block just by default. But we're experimenting, we're kind of innovating, we're really pushing what we can achieve with whiskey. So certainly for me, I don't think you can look back and regret anything, because the nature of whiskey is you have to try, you have to experiment. Mistakes, these things are all part and parcel, especially as a small business. You have to grow, you learn and adapt, and you are constantly learning. There is always so many different things to grasp with whiskey. It's a very simple product on the face of it, the process, but there are so many different ways you can impart your, personality, as an individual and as a brand onto your product. And as a small business, you are so much more than just the product in the bottle. You are an employer, you're part of a community, you can be involved with charity. So, and as craft, what I regard, as craft whiskey producers, our product is always going to be more expensive. We are never going to compete with Scotland, or be, you know, your everyday dram, but are we trying to be? We're not. You know, we want to be something special. We want to bring some personality to that bottle. We want to support charities, you know, plant native woodland, support wildflower, you know, meadows, regenerative farming, be a community hub. You know, for us in the future, we'd love to expand our visitor offering because it's really small. You know, we want to host events. We want to bring people in. We want to communicate our values. So if we can grow and expand our production, but stay true to those values and what we believe to be craft, and our consumers still believe that we're craft as well, then I think we've got a perfect combination, you know, and we are only going to get stronger and better and learn as we go. And I really hope, and we're making some good groundwork with this, I hope that as English Whisky, as a community of distillers, we can, you know, we're never going to agree on everything, but we can certainly help each other out, and we can be, you know, friendly competitors. And because we are bringing such kind of unique products to the table, none of us are copying anybody else. We're just doing our own thing because that's what feels true and right for us. And if we keep going, then, you know, the world's our oyster.
Yeah, and I think it's really reassuring for consumers to hear that you're collaborating and working together behind the scenes, and that it isn't at that stage where everyone's kind of, you know, putting up the drawbridge and saying, oh, no, you know, we're competitors now. And obviously, like you said, you are, but you're also not. So hopefully in 15 years' time, that will still be the DNA of the category. And Chico, I'm terrified to ask you to project 15 years ahead, because I think we might be here for 15 years. But very succinctly, what's your vision for the next 15 years?
To be honest, we are very clear what we are heading to. We know exactly what kind of whiskeys we're gonna release in the future. We know exactly where our kind of signature whiskey gonna sit. We're very close to that point, and we are currently also producing whiskey to release in 10-20 years. We're just making it a different way to not release it so younger. So we're definitely planning the future, I hope wisely. I'm confident of that, and I'm very excited with it. It looks very, very good. Yeah, and I cannot wait to enjoy the growth of English whiskey. I mean, there's so many amazing distilleries in the country, and I think we're gonna go very, very well in the future. And as I usually say, time is the best ingredient. So we'll see what time reserves to us.
Well, time is something that we all have very little of, but obviously we have to use it wisely. So thank you very much for giving up your time this morning to chat with me, and for everyone that's going to watch this and learn from your experiences so far, and your enthusiasm, and obviously your extensive knowledge on the industry and what you're doing. So I guess I should just say that if you are in Yorkshire or Oxford or Derbyshire, and all of these distilleries are open to go and visit, book a tour, go and try the products, buy the products if you find them in your local shop. Obviously, they're also available online. I can't wait for your first release, Abby. Max, I've got both of your bottles, and obviously Chico, I've got plenty of Oxford Rye to work through. So yeah, we'll keep sharing the love of what you guys are doing. But thank you so much. It always excites me to talk to anyone in the English whisky sector, and you guys are three kind of bastions of that. So thanks for your time and for sharing your experiences with everyone today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. Nice to talk to you all.